I was sitting with a customer of ours, and she came in and said, we spend $100 million a year on training, and the ROI is neutral, meaning doesn't help, doesn't hurt. And he literally said, well, if it's not hurting, let's keep doing it. The good news is there is so much opportunity to do good in this field because most of it is not thoughtfully measured. Most of it doesn't have experiments behind it. If you have the data to back you up, you can be legendary.
Well, welcome back to the Meg and Amy show. In just a bit, we're going to have a pretty awesome guest join us, Laszlo Bock. But before we get to that, Meg, I understand you just had a pretty big event occur. What was that?
I am a mom of a college graduate. So yeah, very big
I thought she was
emotions.
just a little baby.
Exactly. All the feels. They tell you when they hand you a baby, everybody's like, it goes by so fast. And I would say that, the elementary school years didn't really feel like they went by fast. The toddler years, the baby years, that felt like it was going slow or as it should be. But I will say the college years went by very quickly. And oh my goodness, the joy of seeing your adult child and all the emotions that brings in you and the enthusiasm that you have for them stepping into their future, even in this weird market and this sort of crazy time. It's just very, very joyful and quite lovely. So yeah, great weekend.
Well, and hopefully your daughter will have as an illustrious career as our guest today. How's that for a segue?
That's pretty amazing.
So he honestly has one of the most impressive bios I have ever seen. So Laszlo Bock is Senior Advisor at General Catalyst, the founder and co-director of the Berkeley Transformative CHRO Leadership Academy, and a board member of the Stanford Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences. He founded, scaled, and sold 2 startups, most recently to NVIDIA. Before that, he spent a decade at Google where he served as SVP of People Operations. His best-selling book, Work Rules, has sold nearly 1 million copies, with all proceeds going to charity. He is an active investor and advisor in startups. And finally, he is also a documentary film and Broadway musical producer with 4 Tony Award-nominated or winning productions. Today, we're going to dig into Laszlo's philosophies, methodologies, and advice.
Yeah, how lucky are we to have such a great guest and also someone who is just really fun to talk to. So I can't wait.
Laszlo, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here with you and Meg.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have you here. So before we dive in, I thought that it would be really great if you might share your meet cute story with Meg.
Well, as evidence that we didn't prepare this, I actually have a bone to pick with her because I met Meg, if I'm remembering correctly, when I was at Humu. So an HR tech company I started in 2017, and then that was acquired in 2023. And I met Meg during the acquisition process. She was at SAP SuccessFactors, and she was smart and funny and thoughtful and just an amazing product and business leader. And she did not acquire Humu.
We tried, Laszlo.
Let the record show we wanted to.
Amazing interaction, great people. Story ended well for Humu, but I have a bone to pick because I think it would have been a lot of fun to work together, and I feel like I missed out on that opportunity. But that I think was our first interaction, and then we overlapped briefly later on the Hydrogen Struggles board, and have kind of stayed friendly and close ever since. And Amy, I know I'm just getting to meet you, but Meg has just been brilliant and courageous and thoughtful in every spot I've seen her. So it's a joy to be here with you both.
It's a bit overwhelming. Yeah. And in fact, my experience with you, Laszlo, is just being a fangirl. So
it's worth pointing out, even before that, or no, maybe it was a little bit after that, where we hadn't spent time together in person, but Amy managed to be able to include me as her plus one on a event you were at with Ariana Huffington.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, "Oh, I am so all in for that." But it turns out you were quite busy and quite popular at that event. So yes, we've been stalking you across multiple things. And before the discussion at Humu, I was stalking Humu for a long period of time as well. And actually, both of those were early days in Humu. Now that I think about it, because I remember Amy picked me up in the city and we went to that event. So, even well before Heidrick, but I got to experience working with you when you were leading our HRCC committee at Heidrick. And I feel like it was such a great grounding. So just context for the audience, this was my very first board. I had been working to get on a public board for actually almost a decade. And I was really excited about Heidrick because it had two really important things. It was an industry that I loved, leadership, and it was also tied to an area that was non-competitive to my day job, which was not as easy to come about. So those were kind of like the key drivers in getting to be part of that great company. But what was exciting for me was also being able to observe and watch great committee leadership, because I found your ability to sort of focus the attention on the important things, distill the conversation to the high value moments, and to make sure we were really thinking through the strategic topics were things that I loved, and it was really fun to be able to kind of watch that leadership. So, a wonderful arc for me. And so selfishly, Laszlo, I want to ask a little bit about this concept of board leadership, specifically for people with HR backgrounds. So our last guest, Jill Popelka, mentioned that her journey to CEO went through board service. I've, of course, found a lot of learning for myself in board service. Tell us a little bit about how you think about what makes a good board background and what that means for CHROs specifically.
Well, the conventional background for a board is that CHROs are not welcome. Most companies want CEOs and CEOs only. They need a CFO or two to sign off on financial statements. And then the only other sort of imperative that had really existed until January 20th of this year was to bring some diversity to the boardroom as well. And that sadly what I hear from executive recruiters is they're more focused on what people bring to the table, which sure, but that stepping away from sort of doing what's right societally is a little disappointing. But so writ large, the spec is a CEO, maybe a CFO. And there are a handful of CHROs on large public boards. There's more on private company boards, but it's still a relatively small percentage. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity. And the reason is, if you ever listen to a CEO give a talk, it could be a panel, it could be a lecture somewhere, it could be on a podcast, it could be a company all hands or whatever. They always talk about the business for maybe the first 10 or 15 minutes. And then the questions are always about leadership. And what the CEOs want to talk to, they don't want to talk about how at P&G they redesigned packaging and it caused a 0.5% improvement in margins. They end up really wanting to talk about leadership. So the CEOs want to talk about it, people want to talk about it. And that's great. But the problem is most CEOs, 99% of them, speak about leadership from one person's lived experience. CHROs are actually students of leadership. And when I was at Google, Eric Schmidt, he always used to remind me that the board's one true power is hiring and firing the CEO. So the main purpose for the board is actually getting leadership right. And HR people see it in multiple environments. They study it. They study different models of leadership. They study how different leaders operate in different places, situationally, psychologically, all kinds of factors. And there's a richness that can come to that conversation that's very different from having 8 CEOs who all have run one company or 2 or 3 companies, but only done it their way and sort of repeated their playbook. So I think there's a huge opportunity for boards to upgrade by including, if a typical board has 10 people, I'd include at least 2 people who are CHROs who can bring that richness and breadth of perspective to the conversation rather than just relying on, one person's lived experience.
I love that. I'm sold. Sign me up.
Well, it's a real need. Like if you think too about why companies struggle and fail, sometimes they bet wrong on technology, right? Intel famously bet correctly under Andy Grove and then bet incorrectly later. So sometimes it's just a business decision, but more often than not, Nike, John Donahoe just left as CEO and was replaced by somebody who'd been at Nike for years and years, and it was a leadership mismatch. He's an amazing guy, but they wanted somebody who actually understood the product and the DNA of that and led through the product and what made Nike great. Look at the difference between Steve Ballmer and Satya Nadella at Microsoft. Right? Microsoft, they're a great company, making a ton of money, found to be a monopoly, nevertheless performed really well afterwards. It was a great place to work. Under Satya Nadella, it became an exceptional place to work. So the choice of a leader, it shapes the destiny of a company. And in most cases, boards sort of come down to, well, here's what I used to do. Here's what I used to do. Let's get somebody who's like one of us. And that's a huge missed opportunity.
I think the other side of board service too is a lot about risk management, and a good chunk of risk can be held within the corridor of people. And of course, there's other risks. There's market risks and, product risks, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the people risks often come on in a different way and have a different scale to it. And so, again, I think having that expertise of not being surprised by that risk, and maybe even having some tools of how to navigate that risk effectively with empathy, but also a real clarity of what good looks like and what not good looks like, right? I think there's a real element to having more lived experience in the trenches of people and risk and leadership. So, yeah.
Not only that, I completely agree with you. And I'll give an example of Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo famously, over the last 15 years, they're this iconic, canonical American brand, right? Like the stagecoach wheels, the gold rush, like they are as American as you can be. They've paid over $3 billion in fines because their employees were signing up customers for products the customers didn't sign up for. So fraudulently signing people up for lots of products and even creating fictitious employee or customer accounts and signing those up. And the underlying issue there is they were very focused on cross-sell, and their annual reports for years talked about how their cross-sell was great, how many customers, and they have charts showing average customer uses 1.5 of our products, 2.5 of our products, 5 of our products. That's a compensation incentive system design failure. And after they got fined the first time, had they had like a strong HR expert on the board, they could have said, like, why don't we examine the way incentives work in this company? But they didn't. And they kept making the same error again, the same unethical behavior, and they got fined again and again and kept adding up. And to your point, Meg, about risk management, people do what you incent them to do. And HR people really, really understand that. A great HR board member at the first instance could have said, let's look at, as a board, all of the incentive plans and see what behavior we're actually telling people we want to see. And they could have saved billions of dollars, salvaged the reputation of the company, but the board composition was wrong.
So important.
Okay, so Laszlo, 10 years ago, almost to the day, you wrote the seminal book on work culture and leadership. And I took the opportunity to listen to it again. And it's really interesting how many of the concepts have been fully adopted by the HR community, even though they were, kind of crazy back, 10 years ago. And then there's still a bunch that are pretty radical, I would say. And then sadly, I feel like in some ways we've regressed from kind of those cultural highs that you propelled the community into and kind of where we are today. So I was curious, recently Malcolm Gladwell released Revenge of the Tipping Point, which was kind of his unlearning, rethinking of his 20-year-old tipping point book. And I was wondering if you were planning to do a Revenge of the Work Rules.
I'm not. Although it's a fun idea. It would be fun. But no, nothing in the hopper on
Yeah.
that front. Just lots of ideas and opinions, but I have not.
Well, right. Well, that's so. So what I'm wondering is like, what have you? And I don't know if you've listened to your own book, your own voice recently, but like anything you've rethought or unlearned since then?
Well, so first of all, to your point about listening to it, so I recorded the audiobook, which was super fun. And I got to get my kids' voices on it and things like that. So there's like a Lisa and Bart Simpson, or Lisa and
Oh, that's what that was. I was
yeah,
wondering. Okay.
it really cuts into like the voices of a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, which were two of my daughters actually like having the conversation, reading the script. So super, super fun. Um, but my wife has listened to it because she uses it to help herself fall asleep. Um, so it turns out it's great for that.
Actually, my husband just did that with the first podcast that we released. I
Yeah.
almost kicked him out of bed.
No, I figure it's the highest praise, right? But on your question, so I think two elements. Like I think you're right. There's a bunch of things which have sort of become more common practice, right? So there's a lot more science and discipline behind how recruitment and assessment happens, and you see a ton of startups, billion-dollar companies in the space, maybe not taking ideas from the book, but sort of thematically doing similar things about how do you actually, in an unbiased way, find the best talent and attract them and keep them. There's some chapters which sort of never got popular traction. My favorite one was a chapter called Pay Unfairly. And the underlying thesis was that most people would agree, like your top performers are worth way more than your average performers. But when you start saying, well, let me pay my top performer 2 or 3 or 4 times what my average performer makes, right? So if my average performer makes, I don't know, $80,000, to pay someone in the same job as a top performer $160,000 or $200,000, that constitutionally feels weird to people. But if you don't do that, that person's going to go and get a job someplace else, and you'd much rather have one of those people than 2 of the average. So this idea of like paying in a way that feels unfairly with a wide distribution of pay never really took off, which is a little unfortunate because
Yeah, that was one of the ones in my still radical category.
yeah. Well, I think it got conflated with people saying like pay unfairly is, I mean, who haven't read the book would say like on the face of it, pay unfairly sounds like you're saying pay one category of people more or less than the others, right? Men or women or black or white or what have you. And I deliberately titled it that way to be attention catching, but maybe overcorrected a little. And then the biggest thing, obviously, like AI is a relatively new thing, so didn't have that to write about. But the thing I sort of, when writing the book, ran out of time for, actually, no, not ran out of time. I wasn't fully confident enough in the work we were doing at Google on diversity and equity and inclusion at the time that I wanted to codify it and make it public. I was very aware that the Google brand at the time carried a lot of weight. And when we put stuff out there, a lot of people would pay attention. And so I wanted to get it right and make sure it was scientifically valid. So that work kept going. Given what's happened in the United States in the last several years, and every sort of socio-political movement, there's a pendulum that swings and there's, overcorrection and so on. So you can quibble at the extremes, but it's astonishing to me at how quickly most companies have abandoned talking about diversity.
It's kind of surreal.
It is cowardice.
Yeah.
And I understand why, like, you're running a business, you're beholden to shareholders. I totally get the logic. But I tried together with a couple of other retired CHROs. We tried a few months ago, we were going to run out like a full page ad, like New York Times, Washington, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post somewhere, sort of in support of diversity. And the idea was if you're in the job today, it's, if you're a head of HR working in HR, you may not be able to speak up because your company doesn't want you to or your boss or whatever, fine. So we actually reached out to a bunch of retired CHROs. We reached out to about 50 of them, thinking these would be people who spent their careers focused on diversity. And when I say diversity, I just want to I mean having an unbiased hiring and promotion process.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not putting a thumb on the scale anywhere. It's just, people like to hire people like themselves who went to the same schools. Why don't we look at every school? Why don't we look at people from different backgrounds? Let's remove that bias from the practice. Of the people we reached out to who got back to us, half said they wanted to sign and half said they would not. And the principal reason they said they wouldn't sign this kind of open letter we were going to run was they were afraid of retaliation. Mm-hmm. If I were writing the book again back then, or if I were writing it today, I would make a clear case for diversity. There's an absolute business benefit. We found at Google through Project Aristotle that it's actually very hard to measure, like there may or may not be one, unless the environment has high psychological safety, in which case there's a very clear benefit. And the logic there is people need to feel free to speak up. Otherwise, they don't share their perspective. So, of course, if there's not psychological safety, you don't see benefit from it. But there's a massive benefit if you do have that environment. And talk about like how to build it and how it's good for people and how, you know, in a democracy, you actually want to be exposed to people who are different from you and come from different backgrounds. So it's kind of good for society. So that's the one thing that was left out because our work hadn't reached a point where I was confident in it that I would absolutely put in today.
I know you're not connected with Google anymore, but are you happy with how they're approaching diversity, at least like in the public sphere now?
As you said, I haven't been connected since the end of 2016. I haven't seen what they're doing publicly. I used to see a lot, so that may mean something. So I don't know how they're behaving any differently from any other big company. But I would say in general,
they're not touting like the rise of masculine energy, at least, though, right?
I also haven't seen that. I confess I don't follow them too closely.
Yeah.
But
It may be there somewhere.
yeah.
Yeah, I wonder often about what is the future model of courage and human-centered leadership in a world where people feel vulnerable for retaliation, standing up for principles they believe in. So setting aside the the energy around negativity, I feel like if we believe that psychological safety matters for growth and learning, and if we believe that psychological safety is where you start to understand context and experiences that you wouldn't otherwise, then what does it mean when our leaders struggle to express their own beliefs and values? And what does it mean to model that calculus of risk? And I'm not saying I don't appreciate it. I too really understand that there's going to be a lot of opinions and a lot of polarization and energy around whatever topic you choose. But I would have believed in the past that there were just sort of some core things around ethics and kindness and treating people well that kind of exist across culture and across lots of belief systems. And so it just feels very weird to me that we're in a moment that fear is the ascendant thing. So like, I'm just curious as you think about this, outside of trying to find pockets of bravery and how to cultivate it, what do you think people like us should do where we want to continue to show up for those powerful concepts and help other people be brave around that? Like, how do you think about that?
So I think there's three elements to it. It's a great question. And it's kind of puzzling, right? Because leadership is taught in so many places. And people are lauded for leadership. And another CHRO from a big pharmaceutical company said to me, the silence is deafening. And by the way, like, this doesn't even have to be about any like particular major political issue, like a sort of a nonpartisan issue, for example, is tariffs. Like, tariffs are a tax. They make things more expensive. Like, if you're going to raise tax, and they're a tool of foreign policy, right? Like, why aren't more people going like just announcing giant tariffs and then reducing them, like, doesn't actually generate anything. It's just like then calling that a win, that doesn't mean anything. So like, even on something that's relatively straightforward, just like economics, why aren't more people speaking up? So I think there's three things that are going on. One is the academic research on how people like to be led, what kind of leaders they gravitate towards. shows that somewhere between 20 and 30% of human beings, and this is a caveat that it's like, done in the Western countries, the US, UK, things like that, but 20 to 30% of folks in those countries prefer autocratic leaders. And that means both politically, but it also means like in an office, right? When I was at Humu, we had two employees who we were talking about how to give and receive feedback. And they said, I prefer being yelled at. And no, and I was like, that seems crazy. Probably not going to work out for you here, but like, tell me more. And they grew up in pretty hard Scrabble upbringings. So there was a lot of shouting around them. Both of these people were very accomplished athletes. Like college athletes. And what does a coach? A coach yells and says, go, and that's what they're used to. That's how they're used. And then you get into this like genteel corporate world. None of this feels like feedback. Everybody's just saying like very mild things. But the bigger point there is there's people who like to be given very clear direction. They like structure and clear direction, and they like the stereotypical kind of strong man, and I use man deliberately, but strong man leadership of like, it's a big bold face with a square jaw telling them the path forward. So a bunch of people are just predisposed to that anyway. So that's part of what's going on, and those people want to follow and want to be told what to do. The second thing goes back to the research of Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford, who's wonderful. And he's written, one of his big areas of research has been, why is it we teach all this stuff about leadership and leaders don't actually behave that way? Leaders on average are more narcissistic, more sociopathic, they tend to lie more, they tend to abuse their power more than people lower in the organization. And his whole argument, so this is the second point, is that most leaders actually aren't the kind of people we hope they would be. And so like you have an environment like today, and it's a very natural human reaction for people to say like, I knew it. Everyone was corrupt. It's all like this. It's just what I thought it was. And not argue for something better in the way like our founding fathers did, or Martin Luther King.
Just throw up the hands.
Yeah, just say like, yes, the system has revealed itself, instead of saying, here's what we aspire to be. And then the third is, and this is more practical to the last part of your question, there's a great editorial in the New York Times. The title was something like, What I Learned in Dealing with China, or What I Learned in Standing Up to China. This author wrote about, there was a Chinese gentleman, Chinese national, who was outside of China in the US, and he'd said some things against the Chinese government. Some of his friends in China had said the same thing. And his friends in China got arrested. And he announced from the US before traveling back to China that, I'm going back to China, I expect to get arrested. And he went back to China and he was detained by the police, but he was not arrested. And he wasn't arrested because, according to the writer of this editorial, the local government officials reasoned, well, he's gotten some profile, he's gotten visibility, it's kind of going to be worse for us if we make an issue of this than just let him go. And the author's argument was, the reason you show courage and the reason to stand up is, A, it's the only thing bullies respond to. It's not like you get credit for, complying in advance. You just got to stand up, and, bullies respond to being punched in the nose. And it doesn't work all the time, and it's risky, and it certainly feels terrifying, and there's more at stake than others. But think back to schoolyards. Like, if you're being bullied, the correct thing is not to just keep giving your lunch money, because all that's going to result is they're going to take your lunch money and then they're going to steal your sneakers, right? You punch a bully in the nose.
And you learn to run fast.
But the second point this author made was that standing up also restores your dignity. It restores your dignity as a human being. Because each of us have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and each of us have a right to live our lives without fear of arbitrary enforcement of laws or the failure to enforce laws, like the structure we've all formed a compact to be a part of. And if you allow that to weaken, you're also weakening yourself, your soul, your sentience, your existence as a citizen. You're giving up that dignity. And you're saying, it's okay. I'm okay being part of something lesser, and I'm willing to go along with something lesser. And so, both because it's strategically correct to stand up, and because it's actually better spiritually, more leaders should be doing that. But they're not, because of the first two reasons.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about is the idea of not just standing up individually, but things that we can do to make it better for others. So one of the things you're doing is the Berkeley program for CHROs. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? What made you decide to do this? and what you're hoping this does to the profession of CHROs?
Yeah, I realize we wandered a little far afield from pure HR type things,
No, this is
but it's
perfect.
leadership.
This is exactly where we like to go. We're all over the place by design.
When I got to Google, I realized it was a very different kind of company and we needed a different kind of HR team. So I had what I called a 3/3 model. A third of my hires were traditional HR folks, a third were analytics folks, PhDs or master's degrees, and a third were former consultants. And there were reasons for that constellation. And every year we'd measure it to make sure hiring was along those lines. And then a couple years ago, Heidrick and Struggles actually, a guy, Brad Warga there, who runs their human capital practice, reached out because a client of his had said they're recruiting for a CHRO, and one of the success factors they want to look at is how many CHROs did that person generate in their prior job. And Brad said, well, the second highest person created 24 CHROs. It was this guy, Dennis Donovan, who was the head of HR 20 years ago. He said, you had the highest number of people who have gone on to become CHROs, and it was over 150 people.
Wow.
And I only share that because we built Google using kind of a different model of HR talent and skills, and the people from that cohort have gone on, like the head of HR at General Motors, Arden Hoffman, who, by the way, I taught nothing to. She was like Athena fully emerging from like she came in perfect. But so for major companies, so it gave me the confidence that, okay, maybe there was something to this recipe. And so I ended up in touch with Samir and Jenny and said we sort of designed a program that addresses what I believe are the 4 fundamental gaps that make the difference between a good CHRO and a truly transformative one. And they are, number one, analytical skills, to be able to prove what you're doing actually has an impact rather than just that people like it. The second is what I call elite consulting style problem structuring skills. So for example, most folks, if the CEO says we need to hire 10% more people, will say, I need 10% more recruiters. A consultant would say, well, there's 3 things you need to look at. Your sources of talent. So, that includes marketing, advertising, corporate brand, referral programs, recruiters. Your throughput, how many people are kind of going through your process. And finally, retention. Because if you keep more people, you don't need to hire as many, right? That structuring is not a natural way to think, but consulting teaches it to you. The third is there's some very specific areas of knowledge, like how to work with the board, executive comp. We also teach statistics, experimental design, and financial statement analysis and valuation. Because as an HR person, and you two will appreciate this, having been on the business side, if interest rates go up and your company suddenly decides not to do an acquisition, you need to know that, it's because higher interest rate means the discount rate went up, which means the value of that company went down, therefore we shouldn't do the deal, rather than just, the CEO is nervous, right? And then the final and fourth thing is cross-company mentorship and collaboration. So every cohort ends up in this WhatsApp group, and it's beautiful because they're sharing family photos, they're sharing tips, best practices, job, like it's amazing. But that community with them, and then we have this amazing advisory board with the CHROs of, Pfizer, Nike, Chevron, just about every amazing company. And that's all available to the students. So the idea is give the students these 4 things and they'll become transformative CHROs.
How big are the cohorts?
Each one is about 35 to 50 people. And so we have one running right now. The next one is enrolling, and I don't think the dates are on the website yet, but it's going to start in March of next year. So the current one's going to go till October, and then we take a break because Q4 and Q1 are busy seasons for HR, and March of next year, the next cohort will start.
You mentioned a lot about like analytics and you're obviously super data driven, and one of the things that really shone through in the book was how many experiments that you ran and your organization ran, and one of them was about managers and maybe eliminating managers, which you found was not a good idea. So that was nice. But in today's AI craziness, there's a lot of announcements, a lot of talk about eliminating layers, eliminating managers, etc. And so I was wondering what you thought about that, and also like what sort of experience, if you were in charge of a company right now thinking about it, what sort of experiment would you run?
The scientific data on the impact of AI is the early data has a couple clear insights. One is for a lot of tasks, AI is good at making below average people perform at an average level, especially for structured tasks, repetitive tasks. So the interesting question that raises is if average performance in a company goes up, right? Because if your bottom half comes up, then the average is going to rise. That's going to generate economic returns, right? And who gets to keep that? Is it the company in terms of profits, which maybe translates into shareholders? Is it employees in terms of wages? Is it executives? So there's this a really fascinating philosophical question we need to work out. The second thing that AI does is it turns out for highly complex tasks, it makes human augmentation worse. So there was this great study done by a Harvard professor combined with Boston Consulting Group on their consultants where they did this sophisticated case, just like a client engagement. They gave it to a bunch of consultants. Consultants got like 80% right. They gave it to an AI, gave them all the data. AI got 60% right. They had consultants then work with the data, with the AI, and they only got 70% right. So the consultants plus the data plus the AI was better than the AI alone, but worse than consultants by themselves. And what appears to be the issue is we perceive AI to be authoritative. We're used to, if it's written down, it's probably true. Google search results tend to be reliable. AI, an interesting thing happening is the AI models are hallucinating more as they get more sophisticated. So OpenAI's O4 Mini hallucinates 48% of the time, and O3, the prior version, hallucinates 38% of the time.
So AI Dunning-Kruger is the new
It's a real thing.
thing.
It's a real thing. So what I would do is I would figure out either, if I were CHRO or people analytics team or head of L&D or whatever, what's the biggest pain in the business or what am I most passionate about? Like a bunch of the Google projects grew out of my own personal interests and passions, and that will motivate you and the team. And then I would design a randomized control trial where you deploy the AI for a population and no AI or AI plus humans for a third population. And you have clear outcome metrics and you actually run a scientifically valid experiment. And the reason you have to do that is because otherwise assessment of AI is just based on vibes. And you saw Klarna kind of announced a year ago, they were laying off their customer support staff, tons of people to replace with AI, and now they're hiring people back. So you need to actually, the key to unlocking the value from AI in your organization is 100% to design thoughtful, scientifically valid experiments, which will tell you whether the AI is working or not.
And one of the things that you mentioned in your book, and I assume is still part of your core, is running them all the way through. Even if it's painful, even if people are like chomping at the bit to be able to participate, to make sure that you run it all the way through and you get the results.
For sure. Well, so this relates to like the best example of that was the diversity stuff we talked about before. But yeah, you have to. Well, actually, I'll give a more recent example. In the last cohort we had at Berkeley, one of the teams. So everyone gets divided into teams. Everyone submits a proposal for a project, and then they actually do it at one of the companies. And so this was at a consumer products company, and the hypothesis they were testing was that this new training they had developed was improving retention. And everyone loved it. They thought it was good. And they ran the experiment and they found it was not improving retention. It had zero effect. So scientists call that a null effect. And they got to completion. And instead of being upset, they're like, well, this is great. We can either tweak the program and see if it helps, or we can just shut it down and get the money back. And in either case, had they not actually run the full experiment to completion, they wouldn't have known. And what's tricky is in the people space, these experiments can take a year, 2 years, 3 years. So you also have to be patient with it. But if you're not, you're just going to blow money and waste people's time.
And you're not going to build improvement into your culture. You're going to build confidence based on hope or...
It's interesting. Like if you run the analytics inside, anybody who's listening or watching companies, most companies have all kinds of training programs. On average, the effect of manager training programs is negative. So actually managers on average end up worse after taking training than before taking training. And it doesn't make sense because you figure how, maybe they stay the same. Why would they get worse? what ends up happening is if I'm a manager and I go to training and you're my team, I say, hey, I'm going to go to this training. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to come out. I'm going to be an amazing manager. And so I go to training and I go through the stuff and then I come back and I do a couple things differently. And meanwhile, your expectations have gone up. You're like, awesome. Laszlo's kind of a jerk. This is going to mellow him out. He's going to be easier to work with. Like, this is going to be terrific. And maybe I sustain that for a week or two or some piece of it. And eventually I go back to my old habits. But your expectations don't drop. Mm-hmm. So the manager goes to the training. Their bar with their team has gone up. And their performance actually doesn't change, but the perception of their performance by their teams and their own managers goes down because the expectations rose. So most training actually has a negative effect, but you only see that if you actually run the experiment, as you said, Amy, to completion.
Man, there's a lot to learn.
It's messed up, isn't it? When I was at Humu, I was sitting with a customer of ours, and they were a 50,000 person company. They were $2+ million a year in revenue for us. Terrific customer. I was sitting with the head of HR and having breakfast with him and his head of people analytics. And she came in and said, we spend $100 million a year on training, and the ROI is neutral. Meaning, doesn't help, doesn't hurt. And he literally said, well, if it's not hurting, let's keep doing it.
So no sense of $100 million might be allocated to something like buy some bagels. I don't know. Yeah.
Crazy, right? Like absolutely crazy. But that's the good news is, for anybody who's paying attention, there is so much opportunity to do good in this field because most of it is not thoughtfully measured. Most of it doesn't have experiments behind it. As we were discussing, most leaders don't have the courage to say like, hey, management, I know you love this program and it's your favorite thing, or I know you love referral bonuses, or I know you love hiring from these 5 schools. Actually, we should go to the HBCUs, or we should go to our local state college, or we should stop doing referral bonuses. If you have the data to back you up, which helps give you the courage to say that, you can be legendary. And it's amazing.
We have a tradition on the show of taking questions from the audience about leadership. Would you like to join us to answer this question?
I can't guarantee a good answer, but I can.
That's all right. That's all right. We don't this is not investment advice or.
So
Okay.
You'll answer first, and then Meg will go, and then she'll have the correct answer. And then Meg will go, oh, of course.
Yeah,
so that's
cool.
the way it usually works.
Okay.
Anyway.
I'm so excited.
All right. So here's the question. I am getting pressure from my board to replace a key member of my leadership team. I can understand their urgency and point of view, but I'm conflicted and concerned they are not properly considering the organizational risks of this change. What should I do?
Okay. Well, the first thing is you need to understand whether your board controls the place or not. So if you're in like a publicly held company, sometimes boards have tremendous power and influence, and sometimes they have less so. So you first need to, and if you're in a private company, like family owned, if it's a family member, they control the company. If it's not a family member, they don't. If it's private equity owned, again, some private equity firms control the firm, others just sit on the board. So it depends. But the first thing is, do they actually control the place or not? If they control it, you got to take it a little more seriously. Second, it's almost certain. The person asked, I can understand their urgency, but I'm conflicted. They might not be considering things, right? Number 2, they absolutely do not have full context. There's just no way they have full context because they're not on the ground with you and things like that. So number 3, the correct thing to do is you need to take the feed. Oh, and actually the other piece is sometimes when boards say things, they're just asking. Like, at both my companies, I've had board members, I've sat on boards. Sometimes you say like, I don't think our chief revenue officer is doing a good job. Sometimes that's just a way of having a conversation or saying like, how do you think that person is doing? But they're not saying you must fire the person. So what do you do with all this? Number 1, assess, do they control? Are they just asking or are they directing? And depending on the answers there, you either give them more context and say, well, here's my plan, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm not taking action today. It's probably politically correct to then say, but I'll circle back with you and keep you updated and let you know how things go. you then need to decide whether the person's worth saving, because they might have bad data, but they could be right. And it's not unusual for them to have some good insight. So it might be the person's not worth saving. If they are, you need to put in the work to rehabilitate that person in their eyes.
And how do you do that?
Well, what I've done in the past is a couple different things. And I haven't always been successful rehabilitating folks in this way. But sometimes you hide them. So I had an executive reporting to me years ago, and a couple members of not the board, but the leadership team had written this person off completely. So I layered them under somebody else. And then the person I layered still had a great career, great job, company grew, like everything ended up well. And I never actually told the person. That's why I layered them. Other cases, it's like coaching a brand new associate in a consulting firm where you choreograph every meeting they have, you prep with them, you have to invest. I've had to invest a lot of time in some people where it's like, let's go slide by slide, let's rehearse it. What are you going to say if this comes up? I'm going to be in the room just in case. After the meeting, you debrief it. It's a lot of work. But if you know this person is good and they're just getting a bad rap, it's worth it.
Meg, anything to add?
I tried to cover so much ground, but there was nothing else.
I completely.
So never mind. You're the new Meg. So, yeah.
No way.
So the only other things I would say is, in my own experience, there is always something I'm not seeing when this is what's been presented to me. So I do tend to start with getting really curious. So spending some time with the board members with a tell me more mindset, like give me some examples. What exactly is it? Like just making sure I understand the problem they're trying to solve, because again, that can inform my what do I do next in no matter what road I take. The second thing is, I will say for myself, in the end, when I've taken longer to be decisive about a leadership change, I've always regretted it. It's always been better when I've made a leadership change. So if they're pointing out something you already know and you've just been kind of dreading the hard work it's going to be to take that next step, I think it's a useful reminder from having lived this that most of the time, if you do it right, it's better for everyone. It's better for the person who's got this like slope they're never going to achieve, where they're going to keep working harder and harder, and they've already got this weight on them that will keep them from being successful. And it's harder for me as a leader because, to Laszlo's point, you're going to spend so much time trying to augment that deficiency yourself that there's an opportunity cost to what else you're not doing in that time frame. So I guess I would start with assume they might be right. Assume that you might have to take some action. What does that mean? And then in that, if you can't come to a conclusion that they're right, you'll feel more convicted in how you convince them otherwise. But I think the first move would be assume there's some wisdom you're missing, and get really curious and set aside your own hassle and ego to be open-minded to it.
That's a better answer.
No. I was gonna summarize both of them, and I think just being really objective about the person, and then being committed to the work, whether that is the work to remove the person or the work to rehabilitate the person. But like,
also
it's going to be work no matter what.
Well, so I will reveal one. Everyone like, what's your greatest weakness? And it's always like actually something that makes them sound awesome. But one of the things that is legitimately a weakness that has actually caused me problems is I am overly loyal to the people around me, and that informs my answer to the question, which is like, initially find a way to like dodge it and push back. And so, as a practical matter, your answers are actually much better and more useful. And
but yours are human. I mean, not that Megbot isn't also human, but
no. But the thing is, as a practical matter, like it actually, like sometimes I'll talk to my wife, and in retrospect, things are always so much more clear. And I'm like, had I done this would have, this would have worked out better. That would have worked out better. Like it, in Google and defending folks and things like that. And she always reminds me, things worked out just fine.
Yeah.
So,
no matter what.
Which I think is a really good way to think about it, that like there's lots of paths to make something work, and recognizing that you will find your way. I think it's really helpful to people to like don't believe yourself too much, but also be confident that eventually you're going to figure it out. And I think that has a lot of legs to it.
Well, this has been a dream. Thanks so much, Laszlo, for
Yes.
joining us today.
Really grateful, Laszlo. This has been wonderful.
You're very welcome. You're the folks you're interviewing are amazing, and there's so much to learn from the conversations you're having and the community you're building. So thanks for inviting me in.
Ooh, well, my fangirl heart is full.
It doesn't get any better than that, I must say.
That was awesome. All right, so Laszlo Bock. Wow. So what did we learn today?
Well, certainly we learned the personification of big brain, big heart, great human, making a difference. If we were to think of a role model for being thoughtful, being data-driven, being curious, and showing courage of your values and your convictions, I think I personally feel like I have a lot to learn from Laszlo, and I love having the opportunity to have conversations that make me think.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was neat to hear him talk through the whole experimentation process in detail, and really, how that, I think, personally gave his kind soul, his kind, loyal soul, the ability to build courage and to do hard things, right? So rather than if you're just using your gut, you're just using opinions and what's happened before, it's really easy to fall into either being overly loyal or being, lacking courage to do something new. But having that data really bolsters you. I thought that was pretty profound.
Brings real credibility to whatever it is you're trying to say. Yeah.
All right. Well, next week we are back to the Meg and Amy duo. So we'll dive into the SaaS business model and how it's transforming before our eyes. And of course, with a heavy dose of curiosity and silliness. In the meantime, please do submit questions for future Leadership Corners, and please subscribe and spread the word about the Meg and Amy Show.
And thank you to everyone who's given us really great feedback and helping us keep going at this. Hey, let's invent the future together, everyone. I believe in us.
Make every day count.